Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again with another video. Today I'm going to talk about the chainsaw angles that I use now and the chainsaw angles that I used to use about 15 years ago, and why it's a good idea that you stick with the same angles and don't chop and change all the time. So if I was to go back, what would it have been? It would have been early 2000s when I got my first chainsaw grind. It was only a cheapie, but nonetheless it worked okay, and it was an Oregon 511 and AX, I think it was, something like that, yeah. And it had a tiltable vise as well as a movable head on it, which is top plate cutting angle. So back then I didn't know a lot, and I just went by the recommendations of the chain manufacturer or the Oregon chart that actually came with the chainsaw grinder. And typically they were using around about 60 degrees on the movable head, which is a top plate cutting angle, and anywhere from 25 degrees to 30 degrees. I never questioned it. I just, because I didn't have enough experience. So I just did what was written in the chart. They were my grinding angles. But then as time went on, sometimes you question the difference, and someone was saying, oh, you know, you can have different angles. That's why you've got a different scale on the movable head and a different scale here. You know, the difference between softwood and hardwood. Well, I don't know what it's like cutting softwood, because in Australia we've got eucalypts and we only cut hardwood. So back in those days, I was typically using 60 degrees on the movable head and anywhere from 25 to 30. Then about 3 years ago, I got a Stihl USG grinder. And then I found out that Stihl are a little bit more aggressive than Oregon, and they like to use 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle, another 10 degrees more aggressive. And what I'd noticed, that on the 3/8 standard semi-chisel chain, I thought, wow, this is actually cutting a lot better and cutting a lot longer. And that was one of the reasons that I started using full chisel, because I always felt that full chisel was much more aggressive and cut much better than semi-chisel in clean wood. But then I found out that when I went to the 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle, that it seemed to work much, much better and almost as durable as the full chisel. Whereas when I started using 50 degrees on the full chisel, I never really noticed a huge amount of difference. There may have been some difference. I imagine there would have been an improvement of some sort because it's more aggressive, but it certainly wasn't as noticeable as the semi-chisel. So the semi-chisel, I could be out there in the field for 3 hours, not a problem, before I have to resharpen. So that was definitely a big improvement, and they're the conditions that I use today on all my grinders for semi-chisel or full chisel. 50 degrees here and 30 degrees here, no 25 degrees, 30 degrees, and if recommended by the manufacturer, we'll go to 10 degrees downward tilt. Now, the next point that I would like to mention is that when you change the grinding wheel, you've got a different profile on the wheel. This is hexa, by the way, so it's hexagonal. So we rely on the side of the wheel, the left angle on the wheel, and the right angle on the wheel. And it just looks like a V-shaped on the wheel rather than have a nice radius. So the chain here is a brand new chain, and I don't use that chain, the hexa. I use that so that I can bring the wheel down, and when I want to dress the wheel, at least I've got a hexa chain as an original so that I can use that as my template to make sure that the grinding wheel is set as such. Now, the angles for hexa are a little bit different. They're 60 degrees on the top plate cutting angle. So the movable head is set to 60 degrees, and we set the rotatable vise to 25 degrees. Now this grinder is a Jolly Star, and I've only had it a few weeks, and it's specifically only going to be used to dress all my hexa chains. So because I've reprofiled the wheel, that wheel will be okay for the next 20 or 30 sharpenings before I just bring this back out. And I may have to get my dressing block like this, and my template, I use a 60-degree template to dress the wheel. That's my 60-degree template. It sits in the vise that way, and then I use the grinding block to dress one side of the wheel, turn it round the other side, and use the 60 degrees to grind the other side. And I've got perfect 60 degrees. So that's the way that I dress that. And I dress that with the head sitting in the 90-degree position vertical. And that works really well. So the other thing that I'd like to mention, that if we turn around and say that 50 degrees on the adjustable head works good for Australian hardwood, and 30 degrees works good here, and the 10 degrees downward tilt also works good where the manufacturer recommend it. They're the conditions that I use. The grinder is set up like that. I don't change the head. It's just set up like that at 60 degrees for hexa. However, when I'm grinding standard 3/8, I have another grinder set up here. It's just a Oregon type copy, and we use 50 degrees on that, not 60. So the 60 degrees we're only using on the hexa, on the top plate cutting angle, and 25 degrees on the top plate. Whereas this full chisel chain, right, we're going to use 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle, and we're going to use 30 degrees on the top plate, and 10 degrees downward tilt. Then if I'm doing 3/8 low profile, I'll use this grinder here. Now, I think I've got about 13 grinders, but these three are probably the ones that I use the most. I've got a Stihl USG grinder. I use that as well. I've got 13 grinders. Yeah, I know I'm spoiled. I'm obsessed with grinders. But one of the things that I've found out, because this is a really great hobby for me, is that each grinder has a different type of grinding wheel on it, so I don't have to dress wheels and swap wheels. One of the things that really can wear your chains down abnormally is playing around with different angles and swapping different wheels. So if you were to constantly change the wheel or dress the wheel, change this angle from 50 degrees, then it's 60, then it's 25, then it's 30, a combination of those things, then 10 degrees downward tilt, for every little change that you do, you're going to have to grind that chain until the new profile makes the new shape on the tooth. So if you've changed this from 50 to 60, and this from 25 to 30, and then maybe you use tilt, then next time you don't use tilt, and if you change the wheel also, everything's all different. You're probably going to have to grind in excess of 0.5 millimeter off the chain. So just be aware that if you're going to play around, look, if you're going to buy a brand new chain, whether it's Oregon, Stihl, Carlton, whatever it is, a 20-inch chain here in Australia is around about $50, even up to $60, right? So therefore, I don't want to grind that chain abnormally. I want to get the best bang for buck. And the best bang for buck means that I stick to the same geometry when I set up my grinder. The head stays at 50 degrees. The top plate angle stays at 30 degrees. 10 degrees downward tilt, whether it's a Stihl chain or whether it's another chain, it depends on the manufacturer. It means that if I grind this chain on this particular grinder, and I use this chain, and I go out in the field, and I bring the chain back and regrind it, everything's all set up. If I do it on 3/8 low profile, that's all set up. If I do it on hexa, that's all set up for hexa. So there's just 3 instances, and my steel USG grinder, I use that for 404 chain, so that's all set up for 404 chain, different grinding wheel, different setup. Yeah, that's for the bigger saw. So I always find out that if you've got the machine set up, you don't have to worry about excess grinding metal away. Now, brings me back to the next point. How much metal are you grinding off your chains when you do them? Well, let's just say that you're playing around with different angles all the time. You could be grinding in excess of 0.5 millimetre up to 1 millimetre off your chain if you're playing around with all different angles before you get it right. If you leave your grinder at those set angles, you should only grind between 0.1 and 0.2 of a millimetre after the first grind. Now, what do I mean by after the first grind? What I mean by that is that you can go out and buy a brand new chain, and that chain can be up to 0.5 millimetre variation in tooth length. So therefore, on your first grind, you've got to try and grind that chain uniform on the left and uniform on the right. When you put your chain in here and you set up, let's just say we're going to set it up for the left-hand side, you adjust your backstop so that your tooth comes forward, touches the grinding wheel when you pull the grinding wheel down, and that's like the kiss position. That's the position where the tooth just touches the grinding wheel. That's your starting position. You start the grinder, you do the first pass, and if it's taken enough material off, then you can proceed to sharpen the chain. If it hasn't taken enough material off, you need to adjust your backstop a little bit more, do a secondary grind on the tooth, and if that's taken sufficient amount of metal off, then you can proceed to sharpen the chain. Now, if it's a brand new chain, it really probably won't matter what tooth you start on, but if it's a second-hand chain, I generally like to look at the chain and just pick a tooth that looks like it's about the average length and start with that and mark that with a text up. And that's my starting point. I'll proceed to sharpen all one side. If I find a tooth that's a little bit short and the grinding wheel doesn't touch it, I'll mark that in a different coloured texture. And when the chain's finished, if there's 2 or 3 teeth that were a little bit short, then I'll do them separately. After that, I'll swap to the other side. When I swap to the other side, don't start grinding straight away. Make sure you set your backstop up like you're starting from scratch again on the other side. A lot of people make the mistake where they set up on one side, they automatically swap to the other side and start grinding and wonder why they're taking too much metal off. And how many times on the forums you'll hear, oh, why does my chainsaw grind one side more than the other side? Because you didn't set it up on the other side. You just switched over and started grinding. That's generally the main reason. The only other reason, that's the only reason. I was just going to say the only other reason it could be slightly different. If your wheel's really small and it's off center, that could be a problem also. But generally speaking, it's because you didn't set it up properly in the first place. So I hope that information helps, because chains aren't cheap, and if they're between $50 and $60, you want to take minimal metal off. And just to reiterate that, you're talking about 0.1 to 0.2 of a millimetre by the time after the first initial grind, you may even have to take over 0.5 millimetre off. Because I said, when the chain's manufactured from brand new, the teeth can be out as much as 0.4 of a millimetre between the longest and the shortest. So to get that back into scratch, your first sharpening will be the worst, because you'll have to take that little bit of extra metal off. Every subsequent sharpening, provided you don't change all the angles, you should be taking no more than 0.1 to 0.2 of a millimetre off. And remember, if you're sharpening a knife up, you really don't take much metal off. So the same principle applies to your chainsaw grinder, that you should not be taking a lot of metal off. You're only sharpening the chain. You're not reprofiling the cutters. You only reprofiling the cutters if you start playing around with all the angles and they're all different again. Then if you've changed all the angles, then the grinding wheel has to reprofile to those different angles, which means it's going to use a lot more metal than actually sharpening. You're reprofiling, which could take in excess of 0.5 millimetre up to 1 millimetre of material. And considering that a 3/8 tooth is about 10 millimetres in length, and you've only got about 7 millimetres to play with, to waste 1 millimetre is more than 12 to 15% of the length of the tooth. So yeah, just be aware of that. Don't play around with all the settings. Try and find the settings first that work for you. And as I said, I've got Australian hardwood. I'm cutting grey box. I'm cutting stringy bark. I'm cutting red gum. I'm cutting iron bark. They are some of the hardest, especially the grey box timber that's around. So 50 degrees here, 30 degrees here, 10 degrees downward tilt if required. And they're the settings that I use. And those settings work quite well in green timber. They still work all right in dried timber, but it's not as durable because it's bloody hard as a rock. And they will certainly cut through green hardwood like a knife through butter, provided also that you set your rakers at the correct depth. So yeah, if you neglect setting your rakers, it doesn't matter how sharp your chain is, you won't cut properly. You'll only be cutting nowhere near 100% efficiency. Get the rakers and use a progressive depth gauge. Don't use that constant flat one because they're not really designed to work efficient. The most efficient gauges are the progressive depth gauges from Stihl or Husqvarna or West Coast saws. These are from Stihl. There's two different types here. One's for 3/8 low profile. That's this one here. And this is for 3/8 standard. These do a much better job than the constant flat gauge. Constant flat gauge only ever sets 0.65 of a millimetre. I hope this information helps. It's just so that you get better life out of your chain, which is better for you in the long run. It's a much better option if you can set this up so that when you come back from cutting a lot of wood, which is currently at the moment, we're in wood cutting season, so I'm sharpening chains fairly regularly. And I know that if I put a 3/8 chain on here, whether it's full chisel or semi-chisel, don't have to muck around with angles or reprofiling the wheel or changing the wheel. If I've got 3/8 low profile, I'll use that grinder. And if I've got hexa, I'll do that one. And if I've got 404 chain, I'll bring out my Stihl USG. So I've got 13 grinders in total. And most of them are high quality. And I've got a few cheap Chinese ones amongst them as well. Anyway, that's a bit of information. Hopefully that will help. So thanks for watching. Bye for now.